1917. Wartime Britain. A prime minister kidnapped. A secret that could change the world. But who is behind it? Only Poirot can uncover the truth. It was the year 1917. The world was aflame with the chaos of World War I, the shadows of conflict stretching far and wide. Across the Channel, Britain stood poised on the edge of uncertainty. The air was thick with whispers of betrayal, the fate of nations hanging in the balance. But nothing could have prepared the country for the chilling event that would unravel the fabric of its political stability. In the quiet heart of London, under a sky streaked with the smoldering hues of an impending storm, Prime Minister David McAdam was to face a fate that would shatter the calm veneer of England's government. A figure of great stature and authority, McAdam was an embodiment of Britain's steely resolve. Yet on the evening of the 12th of October, he was targeted in a ruthless assassination attempt that, by all outward appearances, had been meticulously planned. The city was thrown into a frenzy as news of the attack spread like wildfire. McAdam, miraculously unharmed but shaken, had narrowly escaped death. The whole of Britain sighed in collective relief, grateful for the leader's survival. But the true horror had yet to reveal itself. Days later, as McAdam embarked on his journey to Versailles for a crucial peace conference, an event that could alter the course of the war, something far darker occurred. On the lonely road leading out of London, the Prime Minister's convoy was ambushed. But when the dust settled, there was no sign of McAdam, not a single trace. His car was found abandoned, the engine still warm, as if he had been snatched from the very hands of time itself. What followed was a mystery that would chill the blood of anyone who dared to investigate. In the place where McAdam had disappeared, a single, cryptic note was discovered, fluttering gently in the wind. It was plain, its words simple, yet impossibly chilling. Not all is what it seems, and time is running out. Those words echoed in the minds of all who saw them, but none could understand their true meaning. Was it a threat? A warning? Or was it something far more complicated, something that only the mind of a master detective could decipher? And so, the call went out. Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective whose reputation for solving the most intricate of mysteries had reached the ears of every major government, was summoned to London. His old friend, Captain Hastings, met him at the train station with a look of urgency and unease. There was no time to waste. Britain's fate indeed. The fate of Europe itself hung in the balance. Poirot surveyed the scene with his characteristic calmness, his mind already calculating the hidden patterns, the webs of deceit woven into this complex tapestry. His eyes gleamed with the sharpness of a man who had seen it all, and yet this case was different. There was something deeply unsettling about it. The Prime Minister's abduction, on the surface, appeared to be part of a well-planned political conspiracy. But Poirot knew in his heart that there was more to the story, something far more insidious. As the investigation began, Poirot's mind swirled with questions. Was McAdam truly the target of a foreign agent, as the authorities had suggested? Or was there a far more complicated game at play on that involved the highest echelons of power within Britain itself? Poirot turned to Captain Hastings, his ever-faithful companion, whose instincts were as sharp as his own. "Monday, Ummy," Poirot said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "We are not dealing with a simple kidnapping. There are strings being pulled behind the scenes, strings that lead to a very dangerous place. This, I believe, is not just about the life of Prime Minister McAdam. This is about something far greater." Hastings, ever the skeptic, could only nod. There was no denying that something far more sinister than an assassination plot was at work here. And as Poirot and Hastings set off for France, the mystery deepened. What had truly happened to David McAdam? Was he still alive? Or had the powers behind his disappearance already decided his fate? A storm was brewing, and Poirot knew that the answers would only come with time. But one thing was certain: he would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. As the train rumbled along, the wheels of fate began to turn. Cliffhanger ending. And then, as if on cue, a letter arrived at Poirot's hand. It was a plain envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. With a flick of his wrist, Poirot broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the contents, and for the briefest of moments, a flicker of concern crossed his usually composed face. It was a warning, and the message it contained was clear. You are too late. The clock is ticking, and the game is almost over. The Prime Minister will never make it to Versailles. The train continued its journey, the world outside unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. The investigation begins. The train rumbled to a halt in the misty French countryside, the faint outline of a sun rising weakly over the horizon. Poirot, ever the observer, stepped off the platform with Captain Hastings by his side. The air was sharp, cutting through the remnants of the night, as though warning them that the case they were about to delve into would be equally cold, equally elusive. Their journey had taken them to Boulogne, a quiet port town on the northern coast, far removed from the hustle of Versailles and the great expectations surrounding the peace conference. The stakes were higher than ever. McAdam's abduction had thrown Britain's political landscape into turmoil. As they moved through the quiet streets, Poirot's mind ticked over the details, each step leading him closer to a puzzle he knew would be both perilous and complex. It was in the early hours of the morning when the most significant revelation struck. The car meant to pick up Prime Minister David McAdam from the train station in Boulogne had been found parked on a secluded road, untouched. Its polished chrome gleamed dully in the gray light, as if frozen in time, awaiting its passenger who would never arrive. "What do you make of it, mon ami?" Hastings asked, his voice hushed as they approached the abandoned vehicle. Poirot, hands clasped behind his back, examined the car with a critical eye. The leather seats were undisturbed, not a single crease in the fabric, no signs of a struggle, no traces of hurried departure. It was as if the Prime Minister had vanished into thin air. "A well-planned disappearance," Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing with a gleam of understanding. "But why would they leave the car? A kidnapping should be swift, precise. Not a single thing about this makes sense, mon ami. Not one." There was a silence between them, thick with the weight of the mystery that was already taking shape in Poirot's mind. And yet, a deeper question gnawed at him. Why McAdam? Why now, in the middle of such crucial talks? And if it was indeed political, why leave such a glaringly odd clue behind? Poirot turned to Captain Hastings, his expression unreadable. "I have suspicions, my friend, and one of them involves Captain Daniels." "Daniels?" Hastings asked, taken aback. "But he's McAdam's most trusted secretary. He's been by his side through it all." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Indeed. But that is precisely why his behavior raises such questions. He is too calm, too controlled. A man whose every action is measured, and yet he seems to have no real reaction to the Prime Minister's disappearance. It is unsettling." As the two men continued their inspection of the site, Poirot's mind whirred, turning the situation over in his head. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him something wasn't quite right. And then, the mention of a name that had surfaced in whispered conversations among local authorities sent a cold shiver down Poirot's spine. "There is someone we must seek," Poirot said, his voice low. "A German spy. She has been a ghost to the police, slipping through the cracks of every investigation. Her name, well, no one knows it, but she is known as the Lady in Boulogne." "The Lady in Boulogne," Hastings repeated, clearly puzzled. "A spy, and yet no one has a name." "No, Hastings," Poirot replied, his gaze far away as he walked towards the docks. "A name is not necessary in this case. It is her actions that speak louder than any title could. She has been involved in several high-profile disappearances and assassinations across Europe. But why she is involved in this, why she has suddenly resurfaced this, I cannot say." As Poirot and Hastings made their way through the winding streets of Boulogne, a heavy silence descended upon them. The detective's mind was already racing ahead, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into place. But just as he was about to make a breakthrough, an unexpected encounter halted them in their tracks. Captain Daniels, the man who had once been the Prime Minister's most trusted confidant, now appeared before them, stepping out of a narrow alleyway with a face as unreadable as ever. His sharp, well-tailored suit seemed at odds with the grim surroundings, and his eyes held an emptiness that sent a ripple of unease through Poirot. It was the calmness of a man who had seen much and cared little. And that was exactly what made him so dangerous. "Poirot," Daniels greeted him, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I trust the investigation is going well." Poirot's eyes locked onto Daniels, his gaze piercing through the facade. "You must excuse me, Captain," Poirot said, his voice polite but laden with an unspoken challenge, "but there is something I cannot reconcile. You speak as if nothing has changed, as if the disappearance of your Prime Minister is merely an inconvenience. Where is your concern, Captain Daniels? You are his right-hand man, are you not? Is merely an inconvenience. Where is your concern, Captain Daniels? You are his right-hand man, are you not?" Daniels' smile remained unchanged, but there was a fleeting shadow in his eyes, something hidden beneath that polished exterior. "Rest assured, Poirot," he said smoothly. "I am as concerned as anyone else, but I trust that you will find him. After all, there is no one more capable than you, is there?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, the faintest hint of a smile curving his lips. But the smile didn't reach his eyes, which burned with the quiet intensity of a man who knew when something wasn't right. "Indeed, Captain," Poirot replied softly. "But what is it that you are truly hiding? What game are you playing?" Cliffhanger ending. As Daniels turned to leave, he dropped a single, inconspicuous object at Poirot's feet, a delicate, finely crafted brooch. Poirot bent down to retrieve it, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The brooch, though beautiful, carried an unusual insignium that Poirot had seen before, in the files of a long-forgotten case, tied to a shadowy figure from the past. But before Poirot could inspect it further, Daniels was gone, melting into the crowded streets. And as Poirot stared at the brooch, a deep, unsettling thought crossed his mind. Had McAdam truly been the target of a political assassination, or was something more personal, more dangerous lurking beneath the surface? The game, Poirot realized, had only just begun. The suspects' twists start. As Poirot and Hastings sat in the dimly lit café in Boulogne, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to take shape. The French morning mist had lifted, but the heavy fog of uncertainty still hung in the air. The air was thick with tension, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable truth to emerge. Poirot sipped his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he watched the passing figures on the street. Each person, each movement, seemed to carry a secretum that Poirot was determined to uncover. With a sharp glance at Hastings, he began to lay out his suspicions about the three key players in this mysterious game. "First, there is Captain Daniels," Poirot said, setting his cup down with a soft clink. "The secretary of the Prime Minister, a man who seems so utterly loyal, so utterly composed. But Hastings, have you not noticed the cracks in his calm facade? His every gesture is too controlled, too precise. It is as if he is hiding something beneath that cold, calculating exterior. A man who reacts with such indifference to the disappearance of his employer cannot be as innocent as he pretends." Hastings, still uncertain, leaned forward. "But Poirot, he seemed genuinely distraught when we spoke with him. How could you doubt his loyalty?" Poirot's eyes flicked to his friend, his lips curling into the slightest of smiles. "It is precisely because he appeared so perfect in his sorrow that I suspect him, Hastings. The heart does not grieve in such a fashion. There is something more to it. A man who is too careful, too polished, is often the one hiding the darkest of secrets." Poirot's gaze shifted to the window, where the silhouette of a figure passed by. "And then there is O'Murphy, the police officer assigned to protect McAdam. His sudden disappearance after the assassination attempt, though curious, Hastings. We are told he vanished without a trace, as if swallowed by the night. Was he truly compromised by the enemy, or did he make a choice to disappear, to join the conspiracy? And if so, why? Did he become a pawn in a larger game, or was he part of the plan all along?" Hastings frowned, remembering the few times they had crossed paths with O'Murphy before. "It just doesn't make sense, Poirot. He was an honest officer. Why would he betray his country?" Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled before him. Ah, my dear Hastings, honesty can be a very flexible thing in times of war. Sometimes it is not betrayal for a man to take a different path, it is merely survival. And then, as Poirot's eyes glimmered with a quiet intensity, he turned his attention to the third suspect, the enigmatic woman of Boulogne. Then we come to her, Poirot said, his voice taking on a darker tone. The woman in Boulogne, a mysterious figure, a woman of many secrets. She lives alone in a house on the outskirts of town, near the coast. Her connections to German spies are well known. Yet, I do not believe she is simply a pawn in this intricate web. No, Hastings. She is the spider, not the fly. Hastings's eyebrows rose in surprise. You think she's the mastermind behind all this? Poirot's lips twitched in a smile, though it was the kind of smile that suggested he had just uncovered a hidden layer of the case. I believe she is playing a far larger role than simply being an accomplice. She is intelligent, calculating, and above all, she knows how to remain unseen, how to manipulate those around her without leaving a trace. Just as Poirot spoke these words, a curious thought crossed his mind, a troubling theory, one he had not fully explored until now. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. Hastings, I believe we are being misled. This kidnapping, this so-called political assassination, was a cover-up. A smokescreen designed to divert attention from something far more dangerous, far more political. Hastings blinked, trying to follow the shifting currents of Poirot's thought. A cover-up? But why, Poirot? What could possibly be more dangerous than a high-profile kidnapping in the midst of a peace conference? Poirot leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. A secret is hidden in plain sight, Hastings. The kidnapping is nothing more than a diversion, a distraction. A carefully orchestrated move to pull the eyes of the world away from something much more valuable, something that will tip the scales of power in Europe. Valuable something that will tip the scales of power in Europe. The pieces began to fit into place for Poirot. The cold, calculating demeanor of Daniels, the disappearance of O'Murphy, and the woman in Boulogne were all part of a much larger game. The question now was, who was playing it, and what were they willing to risk to win? Poirot walked briskly to the door of the café, his eyes scanning the streets once more, looking for any sign, any clue that might break the case wide open. And just as he turned to leave, Hastings caught his arm. Poirot, what's the next move? Where do we go from here? Poirot paused, his eyes glinting with an unsettling calm. We follow the trail, Hastings, but we must be careful. For sometimes, those who play the game of shadows do not reveal their hand until it is far too late. And with that, Poirot stepped into the street, his mind already racing toward the next step in the investigation. But as they moved toward the shadowed alleyways, a thought crossed Poirot's mind, a disturbing possibility. What if the game was far larger than even he could comprehend? Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Hastings made their way down the foggy streets, a sudden commotion interrupted their path. A figure dashed past them in the shadows, disappearing into the alley before Poirot could fully react. Who was that? Hastings demanded, but Poirot was already moving, his sharp eyes following the figure's retreating form. Suddenly, Poirot stopped, a cold realization dawning upon him. The brooch he had discovered earlier, the one that Daniels had dropped it, was missing. The game, Poirot knew, was no longer just about solving a kidnapping. It had just become a race against time. The midpoint. The days had grown colder in Boulogne, the kind of biting chill that made one's breath visible in the air, as if the city itself was holding its secrets tightly. But Hercule Poirot, ever observant, knew that it was not the weather that was heavy, it was the weight of the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Prime Minister David McAdam. Poirot and Hastings stood in the narrow hallway of a quiet French hospital, where the hum of distant voices and the faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air. They had come to verify a detail in Captain Daniels's account, the supposed facial injury McAdam had sustained during the assassination attempt. According to Daniels, McAdam had been injured, and it was this injury that had necessitated his removal from public view. But something about this claim didn't sit right with Poirot. I've reviewed the records 3 times, the head nurse said, her voice sharp with annoyance. There is no record of Prime Minister McAdam seeking medical attention at our facility, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed, and his gloved hand brushed over the faded patient files, which lay neatly stacked on the counter. No sign of McAdam's name, no evidence of any injury. It was as if the man had never set foot in the hospital at all. "Ah, this is most curious," Poirot muttered to himself, turning to Hastings. "You see, my friend, the pieces do not fit. It is as though Daniels has crafted a story, a fabrication, to cover something far more sinister." They walked out into the crisp air, their footsteps echoing down the empty street. The mystery had deepened, and the closer Poirot came to the truth, the more perilous the journey became. They had already encountered too many shadows lurking in the corners, waiting to pounce. Hastings' brow furrowed. But Poirot, if McAdam wasn't injured, then what happened to him? Why would Daniels lie about it? Poirot's eyes glinted with a mixture of determination and apprehension. "I suspect, Hastings, that this is not merely a kidnapping, but a meticulously planned diversion, a false trail leading us away from the true conspiracy. The assassination attempt was staged." "But why?" They walked for hours, meeting with informants, examining old documents, and uncovering connections that seemed unrelated at first, until they formed a disturbing pattern. It was not just the kidnapping of a prime minister that was at stake, but the very fabric of power itself. Then, late that evening, a shadow crossed Poirot's path, something subtle, but impossible to ignore. A figure in a long coat, barely visible in the darkness, watched Poirot from a distance, just out of clear sight. It was as if the very air had thickened, charged with danger. Poirot's sharp mind immediately went to work. "They are watching me," Poirot muttered under his breath, his eyes never leaving the shadowed figure. His mind raced as he calculated the situation. The conspiracy, whatever it was, had now grown far more dangerous. The enemy was not merely trying to hide McAdam, but they were targeting Poirot, the only man capable of seeing through their deception. The next morning, Poirot's suspicions were confirmed in a most chilling way. He and Hastings had just entered the main square when a high-pitched screech sliced through the air. A car, speeding far too quickly for the narrow streets, swerved uncontrollably towards them. The driver, masked and cloaked, slammed on the brakes at the last second, sending the vehicle skidding dangerously close to the two men. The crash seemed inevitable, but just before impact, the driver pulled away, leaving Poirot standing in the street, his heart pounding in his chest. Poirot's hand went to his lapel, where his usual sense of calm had been momentarily shaken. "Hastings, you see, I have underestimated the complexity of this case." He stepped back, catching his breath, but his mind was already spinning. This is no mere kidnapping, no simple political maneuver. There are people in high places, people in power, who will stop at nothing to hide the truth. Hastings looked at Poirot with a mix of disbelief and concern. "That was no accident, Poirot. Someone tried to kill us." Poirot's gaze was steady, calculating. "Indeed, Hastings. And now, I believe the conspiracy is far closer than we had imagined. This is no longer about McAdam, not entirely. This is about something much more dangerous, something far deeper than a mere kidnapping." Poirot turned on his heel, his steps quickening as he made for the small alleyway ahead. His thoughts were as sharp as ever, but a flicker of doubt lingered. Who could be behind this? Could Daniels be a pawn in a greater game? Was the mysterious lady in Boulogne really pulling the strings? Poirot's senses were heightened, and it was then that he noticed something else just as he turned the corner. A familiar figure in the distance disappeared into the shadows. The woman, the one he had suspected all along, was walking away from a building he knew to be a safe house for government officials. Poirot's instinct screamed that he was being led to a conclusion that would change everything. And then, the realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. The conspiracy he was chasing wasn't just political, it was personal. Someone in the highest ranks of the government had orchestrated everything to silence the truth. And Poirot knew in that moment that the closer he came to the truth, the more dangerous his investigation would become. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Hastings continued down the narrow alley, Poirot's pace quickened. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that was now so intricate and tangled it seemed impossible to solve. But he would not rest until he had the answers. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke through the stillness, an almost imperceptible sound of something heavy shifting. Poirot spun around, only to see a dark figure dart out from behind a corner and vanish into the shadows. Poirot froze, his heart skipping a beat, his mind churned, putting the pieces together at lightning speed. There was no mistaking it, someone was following them, but more than that, someone was ready to strike. Just then, a voice, low and urgent, whispered from the shadows. "You're too late, Poirot. The game is already over." The final act. The cold gray clouds hung ominously over London as Poirot stood in front of the secluded house on the outskirts of the city. The winds whipped through the barren trees, their bare branches creaking like the bones of forgotten ghosts. In the silence, Poirot's sharp mind clicked into overdrive. His instincts told him they were close, so close. In fact, that he could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath. "Hastings," Poirot said, his voice steady but edged with an unshakable resolve. "We have reached the final act, and I do not believe it will be a simple conclusion. Not this time." Hastings looked up at him, eyes filled with uncertainty. "Poirot, you're not suggesting." Poirot cut him off with a sharp glance. "I have no doubt that this house holds the answers we seek. But be prepared, my friend. The truth here will not be easily swallowed." They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled against the gravel as they approached the large, crumbling house. It seemed deserted, forgotten by time, but Poirot's senses told him otherwise. The house was anything but abandoned, and it was the center of a dangerous web of lies and deceit. Inside, the rooms were dimly lit, the air stale with age. The once grand chandelier hung crookedly, casting eerie shadows across the room. Poirot paused, sensing the weight of the eyes upon them, though no one was in sight. "Hastings, you feel it too, don't you?" Poirot asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The shadows here are not just of the past. Someone is watching." Hastings nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his revolver. "It's too quiet. Something doesn't feel right." And then, as if on cue, the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. Standing in the doorway was none other than Captain Daniels, his face twisted with something far darker than the grief he had shown earlier. Behind him, O'Murphy loomed, his eyes cold and calculating, like a man who had already decided the outcome of the game. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah, Captain Daniels," he said with a calmness that belied the tension in the room. "It seems you've been playing a much more dangerous game than anyone could have imagined." Daniels smirked, his fingers twitching near the inside of his coat. "I must admit, Poirot, I'm impressed. I didn't think you would make it this far. But I suppose that's your gift, isn't it? Always seeing what others miss." Poirot took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Daniels. "You orchestrated the entire kidnapping, but it was not just McAdam you sought to manipulate, was it? You were after something much bigger." The air grew heavier, the realization sinking in like a cold weight. Daniel's smirk faltered, replaced by a steely glare. "You think this is just about McAdam? About a kidnapped Prime Minister? No, Poirot, you're still missing the point." Daniel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "This was never about a man. This was about power." A creeping chill ran down Poirot's spine. You were not working alone." "No," Daniels admitted, his voice lowering. "I had help. O'Murphy, of course. But the real mastermind behind all of this, well, let's just say you've been chasing shadows, Poirot. You've been chasing the wrong person." Suddenly, from the darkened doorway emerged a figure, a woman cloaked in shadows, her movements graceful and deliberate. It was the elusive lady in Boulogne. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. His instincts had been correct. She was the true architect of this elaborate scheme. She had played them all, using Daniels and O'Murphy as pawns in her much larger game. "The lady in Boulogne," Poirot said, his voice tinged with a sense of inevitability. "So it was you all along." The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. You've done well to piece together the fragments, Hercule Poirot, but you're still too late. Daniels chuckled darkly. Too late indeed. You see, the kidnapping wasn't just to remove McAdam, it was to manipulate the peace talks, to create chaos, to shift allegiances. There are men in high places who wanted this war to continue, who needed it to continue. The entire peace conference was a distraction, and he gestured to the woman, we were the ones pulling the strings. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the final pieces. The assassination attempt, the supposed injury, the political maneuvering, all of it had been a diversion to undermine the peace talks, to sabotage the very heart of government diplomacy. But it was deeper than just a political game. It was about control, about ensuring that certain powerful figures could manipulate history in their favor. And what of McAdam? Hastings asked, his voice low. What was his role in this? He was a pawn, the lady in Boulogne said with chilling indifference. McAdam had no idea of the true stakes. He was the perfect figurehead, a symbol, nothing more. His disappearance would set the stage for the next phase of our plan. Poirot took a slow, deliberate step toward them. So it was all a game to bend the future to your will. But you made one mistake. You underestimated me. The lady in Boulogne's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. I don't think so, Poirot. I've already won. You may have unraveled my plans, but you're too late to stop them. The pieces are already in motion. A cold silence settled over the room as Poirot turned his gaze toward O'Murphy, then back to Daniels, who was now visibly shaken. You're telling me this conspiracy was bigger than I could have imagined. But one thing I know for sure, Poirot continued, is that the truth always finds a way to surface. It may take time, but it will. At that moment, the lights flickered. A noise echoed from the back of the house, a heavy, ominous sound. Poirot's eyes flickered with concern. Someone else was here. The door behind them swung open violently. An armed man, wearing a military uniform, stepped into the room, his pistol raised. It's over, Poirot. Cliffhanger ending. The tension in the room snapped as Poirot's mind worked at lightning speed. He had expected this, the final twist, but even he couldn't have foreseen the danger closing in. Not quite yet, my friend, Poirot said, his voice calm, betraying none of the urgency that had begun to pulse through his veins. As the armed man advanced, Hastings took a step forward, his hand reaching for his revolver. But Poirot stopped him with a simple gesture. Stay back, Hastings. We are not yet finished here. This game is far from over. The lady in Boulogne stepped closer, her smile cold and triumphant. You're trapped, Poirot. You and your friend. This house is surrounded. No one is coming to save you. Poirot, unfazed, turned his gaze back to the door. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the distance, and the door creaked open again. With every step, Poirot's mind was working furiously. The conspiracy was exposed, but could he and Hastings escape the web that had been so meticulously spun around them? The scene ends with Poirot's final words hanging in the air. You think you've won. The game is far from over. You think you've won. The game is far from over. The climax. The Grand Hall of Versailles gleamed with the opulence of the peace conference, an air of optimism mixed with the weight of history. Delegates bustled around, whispering amongst themselves as the room filled with politicians, generals, and dignitaries. In the midst of the pageantry, McAdam, still blissfully unaware of the labyrinthine plot that had been set in motion around him, made his triumphant entrance. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding his timely arrival. He waved, smiling, as if he had just been through a mere inconvenience when, in fact, he had been at the very heart of a perilous game of political chess. But as the applause echoed through the grand hall, Poirot remained still, standing on the edge of the room. His eyes were sharp, his mind already piecing together the final strokes of the conspiracy he had been chasing for days. Hastings, standing beside him, turned to Poirot with a perplexed expression. Poirot, I don't understand. This is the end, isn't it? McAdam's here, safe and sound. The kidnapping's been solved, and the truth's been revealed, hasn't it? Poirot's eyes glinted with that characteristic gleam of someone who was always one step ahead, always seeing more than what the surface showed. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze still locked on the crowd, as if searching for something deeper. "No, Hastings," Poirot said softly, his voice low and deliberate. "The game is not over. Not yet." Hastings frowned, confused. "But the mastermind's been caught. Daniels and the rest." Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "There is one final truth that must be revealed. It's the truth that lies beyond the men and women we have already unmasked." The words hung in the air, thick with suspense. Poirot turned, his eyes narrowing as they focused on one individual man who had been quietly watching the proceedings from the back of the room. Daniels. Hastings followed Poirot's gaze. "Daniels. But he's already been implicated. He's one of the conspirators." Poirot's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile, as if he had just unearthed the final clue that made everything fall into place. "Ah, Hastings, this is where the truth becomes more complicated. You see, the mastermind behind this entire plot was never the German spy we thought it was. It was never O'Murphy. No." Poirot's voice dropped to a hushed tone. "It was someone far closer to McAdam than anyone could have imagined." Hastings' eyes widened. "What are you suggesting, Poirot? You're not telling me it was?" "Yes," Poirot interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "The man who was pulling all the strings, the true architect of this plot, was none other than McAdam's most trusted secretary, Daniels." Hastings recoiled in shock. "Daniels? But why? Why would he?" Poirot continued, speaking with an almost eerie calm. "Daniels had faked McAdam's injury, made it seem as though foreign agents were attempting to assassinate the Prime Minister. But in truth, the injury was a carefully crafted ruse, designed to create a crisis that would distract from a much larger Gamma game to control the upcoming peace conference. McAdam was never the target, Hastings. He was merely the pawn." The revelation hit Hastings like a thunderclap, his mind racing to piece it together. "You mean, the kidnapping was never about McAdam at all? It was about the conference, about controlling the negotiations." Poirot's eyes flickered with that knowing look. "Exactly. Daniels, O'Murphy, and their allies were never interested in taking McAdam out of the picture. They wanted to keep him alive so they could keep him a puppet who would unwittingly control the political landscape at the behest of their hidden masters." Hastings felt a sickening realization dawn on him. "You mean, Daniels orchestrated the whole thing to manipulate the peace talks, to sway political outcomes, to—" "Yes, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice firm now, echoing with the certainty of the detective who had solved the impossible. "The peace conference was nothing but a stage on which Daniels and his associates could play their hand, securing political alliances, creating conflicts, and controlling the future of Europe. McAdam was their figurehead, their puppet." Hastings was silent for a moment, processing the enormity of the plot. He looked at Poirot with awe. "But surely McAdam couldn't have known. He was just a pawn, right? He never knew what was truly going on." Poirot's expression softened, a tinge of sadness in his gaze. "Ah, but that is the tragedy, Hastings. McAdam was never meant to know. The true masters of the game kept him in the dark, even as they used him to manipulate history. And now, as he walks into this room, heralded as a hero, he is blind to the strings that have been pulled around him. He will never know that his very life and his political decisions were the products of a masterful deception. Blind to the strings that have been pulled around him. He will never know that his very life and his political decisions were the products of a masterful deception." As Poirot spoke, the applause for McAdam grew louder, and the Prime Minister stepped onto the stage, smiling and shaking hands with the dignitaries. But Poirot could only watch him with a weary expression, his mind still working, calculating, analyzing. "The truth is a strange thing, Hastings," Poirot muttered, almost to himself. "It is never as simple as it seems. In the world of politics, where power is the greatest currency, the truth is often buried beneath layers of manipulation, of self-interest, and of secrets too dark to see the light." Poirot turned to Hastings, his voice now heavy with the weight of the final revelation. "In the end, it is not the men who make the history, it is those who control them." Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot finishes speaking, A figure enters the room from the back. The atmosphere changes instantly, unsettling stillness hanging in the air. The man steps forward, wearing the unmistakable uniform of a government official, his expression stern and unreadable. Poirot's sharp eyes narrow. He recognizes the man at once. But just as Poirot is about to speak, the figure walks directly towards McAdam, his eyes locked on the Prime Minister, his face a mask of purpose. Poirot watches, his heart pounding. Could this be another piece of the puzzle?